Welcome back to the Redacted Culture Cast. For those who are typically watching on YouTube, you'll notice that the backgrounds are going to be changing quite a bit lately as we're traveling about, recording some important conversations and spending time in parts of the country where we don't live. But that being the case, the work must go on, and how we think about what we believe to be right and true doesn't get to take a break simply because we're on vacation. And the message of today, if you want to call it a message, or the topic of discussion that is raised in this episode, is going to be focused on declarations and manifestos. So if you're still listening to the show and you're still on board with us, thank you very much for the time that you're spending listening. This also is brought to you by the time and effort that you guys put into it as well. If you want to support the show, you can head over to redactedculture.locals.com. That's going to be the best place for us to have community discussion, but also it's how we keep the lights on or gas in the tank as we're traveling. That being the case, thank you very much. This is the Redacted Culture Cast. So the idea introduced in this subject has to do with something that actually comes across oftentimes as a joke, and that would be, it's not a war crime if you win. Now, that term might come across as really spicy for those who believe in something bigger than just themselves. It might come across as crass or immoral. We don't actually believe that might simply makes right. However, we recognize that it has a dynamic that plays out in outcomes. And so if we are sitting here on the 5th of July, trying to remember what we celebrated the 4th of July over, we also will recognize that that Declaration of Independence that the founders and the the people we refer to as our founding fathers signed, in many ways was for them their own death sentence. And when we hear the word manifesto, we oftentimes attribute it to people who commit great atrocities, and for good reason. And a manifesto, as given by a school shooter, is hopefully a window into their soul and what was left of it, and why they decided to do what they did, so that we can look for that warning sign in other people's. But it also can be a statement of anguish, an accusation against the world of why it is corrupt, some sort of statement claiming that the individual who is doing the atrocity is not actually doing the atrocity, rather they're reacting to the atrocities done to them. Now you can introduce your Ted Kaczynski jokes and why the Industrial Revolution was bad for mankind or whatever. But if we look back at history and we look back at Ted Kaczynski, we need to recognize that the actions of his actions in many ways betrayed the motives that he claimed to be true. Or his manifesto was made worse, corrupted even, or negated by the actions of the individual. And one might actually want to ask the question, what would the world look like if, in simplified terms, if Ted Kaczynski won? What would the world look like if the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence ended up losing, and then that document became a manifesto which the government used as a warning sign to crush any future rebellions by any future colonies that would exist? And these thought processes, these thought games, these thought experiments introduce the question at hand. When we look at the Declaration of Independence, we look at a list of grievances. We also look at a list of moral statements, imperatives, and claims that are made by a group of people accusing somebody of not doing what they're supposed to do. The Declaration of Independence included both a criticism of the powers that be, but also a statement about what it ought to be more like. If that criticism only came about by the explanation or the or I'm sorry, if that explanation about what the world ought to be like is only brought about by its criticisms, we recognize that they were saying that something isn't true, but that doesn't mean truth doesn't exist. Rather, that there is a way that things should be, and that they are going to choose to live by that way. In the difference between the manifesto, say, of a school shooter and a document like the Declaration of Independence isn't so simple as who won. In fact, we recognize that there is much more than just the existence of a document than what comes to play, or than how we evaluate. That's a horrible way of saying it. There is so much more to a document than its existence. In fact, it's really the abstract object, the ideas inside that we evaluate. So when somebody has a manifesto and we don't read it and we're not aware of what's in that manifesto, where on our grounds do we stand to make evaluations? Well, one standing is that we are man. But the next question would be, and I think the more rooted question is, do you have a manifesto? Do you have a Declaration of Independence? Do you have a declaration of what is right? Is there somewhere in your home a written piece of paper where you put words out into the world, maybe not into the internet, maybe for no eyes but your own to see, where you make statements like, this is when enough is enough, or I do not believe that I can live under a world or a government that treats me as less than human. And this, when this bridge is crossed, we will call it the Rubicon. Do you have a document like that? Do you have that, and even an unwritten one, inside yourself? Is there a limit to how far you are willing to be pushed, infringed upon, crushed, stepped on, sinned against, acted as an enemy? Do you have some grounds by which to stand on? Or are you simply whinging at the situation that stands before you? For most of us that exist within my age group, we have lived our entire lives hearing about the collapse, the falling apart of America, the destruction of the West, the invasion of the communists, the infringement after infringement after infringement after infringement after infringement that go back hundreds of years. And if you were to remove the context of those complaints and simply turn it into the tone, we might not stand out so different from those people we call the Marxists. Perhaps what we are doing is betraying ourselves by whinging and complaining endlessly about the grievances done to us without ever choosing to do something reasonable about it. And what I mean reasonable about it, I mean something more than the grotesque, oversimplified, reactionary caricature that's painted on the world. No man who has become familiar with violence in that intimate sense is willing to engage in it lightly. And this is why we see so often that those who engage in violence casually are themselves, thankfully, very often not very good at it. But you don't have to be good at violence to cause pain and suffering on your victims. And sometimes a dull knife cuts more than a sharp one. It may not cut as well, but you are more likely to be injured when working with a dull knife, so keep your knife sharp. There's your dad advice. And the same thing goes for how we think about our society. Do we really have grounds to complain about what is going wrong in our country when the maximum level of our participation in it is to consume information on the internet? Do you have a code, something that you live by? Did no one give you one? How pitiful. Why don't you go out and look? This is what I am saying to be true. If you do not know what your line is in the sand, it's very easy to move it, shifting it endlessly until you react violently in outrage and perhaps worsen the scenario for you and yours. It is better to be disciplined, the quiet man with the sharp stick kind of mentality. It is better to be disciplined, but not to mistake discipline with weakness. Do not call yourself reserved when you're just a coward. And so when we talk about manifestos and we talk about declarations of independence, I think there is something of intellectual and moral value to taking out a pen and piece of paper and writing out for yourself what are the things that, if infringed upon, you consider a step too far. And if those things have been infringed upon, you might want to consider what is a moral and just course of action. This isn't to be the willy-nilly, pathetic vengeance pacts that we see floating through society. The complaints about hierarchy or hierarchy or patriarchy, or this completely endless series of whining and complaining and looting and burning that really has the intellectual value of a tribal, what would you call, a tribal savage complaining about how the tribe next door stole their stuff and they want it back. Yeah, you're holier than me, fine. But instead, let's not fall into the pit of petty foolishness, and let us not fall into the pit of petty foolishness and avoid the maw that is cowardice, and give eye to the mocker and say, I am no longer interested in your folly, and choose what you think is right. You may find yourself kneeling before something. This is the life that we live. Do not forget that the value of a Declaration of Independence is not merely in what it says to the receiver, but what the person who wrote it believes. I here am willing to believe that we as a nation can stand on what we believe to be right and true. But we have to do it voluntarily, of our own accord, as individuals. It cannot be a decision forced upon us. There will be no savior in the form of a politician or a general. Rather, it is not me that makes you great. It is not me that makes the society great, but our individual voluntary decision to stand on and consider what we believe to be right and true and good. There is something more important to us than ends justifying the means. When we make the joke that it is not a war crime if you win, we know that it's a joke. We know that it's not reality. It's something that we make fun of. So if you're going to sit down and write a Declaration of Independence, after you've done so, consider, not would somebody else do this, but would you consider that declaration a manifesto? Or is it something more important to you? Is it something that you are writing, speaking, saying that is true, or are you just whinging, complaining endlessly into the ether about how it is simply unjust? We may observe injustice, but that does not make us just ourselves. This has been the Redacted Culture Cast, and thank you for listening.